So polite and quiet, aren't they? We're just going to wait for the bells to ring, because if I start and then the bells go, we'll all have to stop again. Hi everyone, it's so good to have you here, and I'd like to welcome you all, those who are in the room and also those who are joining us online for Interface Week 2022. I'm Jacqui Felgate. It's really nice to be back here at Parliament House. I worked here for a long time. I must say the security's changed though since I was here. It's harder to get in than it was before. So welcome to you all today. I'm going to leave the acknowledgement to country to Councillor Moore in just a moment, but I did want to welcome you all and all of the mayors of interface councils and all of our guests joining us here today. And as I said, those who are joining us on live stream, it is very much the normal even now in 2022. When I was first asked to MC this event, I did have to do a little bit of reading about what interface councils do, and it really became clear quickly that interface councils have certainly undergone a big shift, especially over the past 2 years, as I'm sure you all know. With lockdown and working from home really becoming the new normal, interface communities are now more important than they've ever been, and with life stabilising now, it's the time to focus on how all levels of government can really work together to ensure that people are given the same access to services, community infrastructure and the transport that all of Melbourne really needs. Now, before I introduce our first guest, I'll let you know some housekeeping matters for this afternoon. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers and panellists after the presentation, and I'll facilitate questions from here in Queen's Hall, and also for those who are following along at home. We've got the team here to help. So if you could pop your questions in the chat, I'll read it out from the speakers. So that's why I'll be on my phone. I won't be on Instagram or texting anyone. I'll just be looking at the questions so I can ask our panel this afternoon. And for those who are watching along at home, if you could please put yourselves on mute. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Councillor Carly Moore, the Mayor of Hume City Council. She previously served as the city's mayor from 2018 to 19 and 19 to 20, and is a third-generation resident of Hume who's lived in the municipality all of her life. Please make her very welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon as we launch Interface Week 2022. Thank you also to our MC for the day, Jacqui Felgate. It's fantastic to have someone with your knowledge and profile bringing together this vital discussion on our behalf. I begin today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and I extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. Thank you everyone for attending, both here in person and also online. I particularly extend a very warm welcome to MPs, my fellow mayoral colleagues and CEOs of the interface councils. Your attendance here today highlights our passion and interest in our collective challenges of finding pathways to build stronger communities. So here we are again, another year, and COVID-19 is still on the agenda. We, as a group of councils, have seen no letting up in the pressures we experienced pre-COVID-19. Indeed, with the permanency of working from home for many, we have seen more people spending time in our communities than ever before. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the 10 interface councils are home to over 1.6 million people, making up 36% of metropolitan Melbourne's population. It includes over 410,000 families in a region that continues to grow at a rapid pace. Significantly, interface councils currently account for 49% of growth in Melbourne and 44% of the entire state's growth. The average gross regional product of interface councils contributes nearly 20% of Victoria's total gross state product annually. Despite its strong contribution, rapid population growth means our communities face exceptional livability challenges. This is compounded by changing demographics and the impact of historical underfunding, which has resulted in significant infrastructure and service gaps. This is a strong reason why all of us are here today, working tirelessly to build stronger, more resilient interface communities. I'm looking forward to dynamic discussions, uncovering solutions, and finding new and better ways of working together that positively impact the 1.6 million people who live, work, and play in our communities. Thank you for everyone for being here today, and I'll now hand you back to Jacqui. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carly. Such a great introduction to today's discussion. I'd now like to introduce Michael Buckland, the CEO of the McKell Institute. He joined McKell in 2021 and he has significant experience in policy development and government and advocacy campaigns. He's here today to really give us a deep dive into addressing infrastructure inequality in Melbourne's outer suburbs. We've had a chat. He's fascinating. Please make him very welcome.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. I also wanted to thank you, everyone here and everyone joining us at home, for inviting me today and the Interface Councils for Interface Week. My name is Michael Buckland. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute, and to start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I'd also like to acknowledge the owners of all the land that all the representatives who are here today from all the interface councils come from as well. We note that their inequality is one that infrastructure is only one nature of their inequality, and I want to note their disadvantage. The McKell Institute is an independent, not-for-profit public policy institute, and we seek to gain a greater understanding in some of the biggest public policy challenges that face us. And one of the ways that we've looked to do that is to look at a new way of addressing infrastructure. We always talk about infrastructure in terms of numbers. It's almost like the bean counters win this one, where this is the one policy area where everything needs to add up. And we look at that because it's easy to have a benefit-cost ratio and make all decisions based on that. But that sometimes hides the forest from the trees. In this case, infrastructure, and especially public transport, is always subsidised by government, and so we look at it as serving a greater purpose. A recent study in the UK found that a 1% increase in public transport leads to a 0.5% increase in employment opportunities. That is a major change for opportunity for local communities, many of you who are represented here today. This is what we call the social purpose of infrastructure, and it's something that doesn't get enough attention in the public debate. In particular, I want to thank the Victorian government because they are leading the way in this space. The infrastructure strategy of Victoria lists addressing disadvantage as one of its core objectives. Understanding that infrastructure itself is not just an economic proposition but a social one is key to that. Victoria also has some other good news in that it has recently overtaken New South Wales as the highest spending per gross state product of any state in Australia on infrastructure, and I think that's actually to be applauded at the moment, and it's helped got them through a lot of challenges during COVID. But Melbourne also has another unique challenge that we found when undertaking this research. Melbourne has some of the best public transport, but also the most unequal public transport in all of any capital city in Australia. Just 26% of jobs are accessible within 30 minutes within Melbourne. That is the same as in Sydney, but with a population about 20% larger. If you look on page 6 of the infrastructure report, you'll see that the inequality score in Melbourne is 1.56. That means you're almost 56% more likely to have good quality public transport if you are in the top income bracket versus if you're in the bottom income bracket. One of the things we undertook here was an analysis of the metro area data, which is a measure of remoteness undertaken at the University of South Australia. One of the measures that they look at is transport accessibility. And while Melbourne has the lowest number of areas with a low or limited access to infrastructure, to public transport, it also has the highest difference between a moderate and a high access to public transport. So we wanted to look and understand this a little bit deeper, and I think that's what's brought us all here today. And really it comes down to geography. And it's very worrying here. We looked at, and you can see this on page 7 of the report, which some of you might be able to see in a moment, and at home you'll be able to see it online after this. But we looked at public transport as a proportion of car use because they are the most likely substitutes. And we then compared that percentage by every council area in Melbourne, except for McKell, because they had so little data and so poor public transport that they didn't even rate, unfortunately, if there's anyone here from McKell. But one of the things we found was that on average, the interface councils have 6.7% use of public transport, compared to a Melbourne-wide average of 13.4%. So half the use of the greater Melbourne area. The reason for this, there's a reason for this, and it's because of a historical underinvestment in infrastructure. In the first 100 years since most of our train stations were built, from the 1880s to the 1980s, we built on average more than a new train station every single year. Since then, we're averaging less than 1 in every 5 years. Transport is also an important aspect of infrastructure inequality because it's not just about transport. I spoke about jobs earlier, but it's also about access to other public services. I read in the paper earlier about the opposition leader talking about hospitals, and I note that there's no point having a good hospital if we don't have a way to get there. So one of the things we need to look at is how to address infrastructure inequality. Because it's not just about public transport, it also extends to community infrastructure. Infrastructure Victoria looked at libraries, and will note that 6 of the 8 council areas with the lowest number of libraries per capita are interface councils. I also note on open space. Often we assume open space is undeveloped land. In this case, we're talking about useful open space. And it might be an assumption for many of us that outer city areas have more open space. In fact, usable public space is inverted. The City of Melbourne has 21% usable public space, whereas the average amongst the IFC councils is between 5 and 7%. And the IFC council with the greatest amount of usable public space has just 10%, half that of the City of Melbourne. That inequality results in a lot of different outcomes, a lot of different social outcomes, and I think none of us will see that more clearly than we have over the last 2 years, when outdoor public space, local amenity, local infrastructure were the most important they've been possibly in our lifetime. I want to say it's not all bad news. As I mentioned earlier, Victoria does have a new infrastructure strategy that acknowledges disadvantage as a core part of its objectives. It also has the highest spending per capita, or per gross state product of spending on infrastructure, something we should celebrate. So one of the things we need to look at is what are the risks that are coming to this? Now, the risk is that we have a lot of debt rightly incurred during COVID, and there's a challenge that might lead to some people saying we need to prioritise infrastructure investment. But if we acknowledge that there's a social element to this, that there's an inherent disadvantage and inequality within the development of current infrastructure, then we owe it to those people to address it. There is plenty of money sitting in superannuation funds and private equity that is interested in investing in infrastructure. It's one of the reasons why we recommend having a new infrastructure financing authority throughout Australia to look at how we utilise those funds for better community infrastructure. Finally, one of the things we also look at in this report and make a recommendation to is that with the success of the Level Crossing Removal Authority, the current program ends in 2025. It's time for us to look at what does that authority look at in the future. And we think that should be given a new mandate to address infrastructure inequality, to plan and implement new projects in areas that don't have the adequate infrastructure at the moment, many of which are in outer suburban Melbourne. So I wanted to thank you all for being here. I wanted to share some of those findings, and I wanted to thank you all as representatives of those councils in those areas, and wish you the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I think when you start talking about those types of statistics, it gives us a lot of food for thought and a lot to ask about today. And I think for those of us who are living in well-serviced areas, you know, I think we're a little naive in many ways, and we wouldn't consider the disadvantage of not having the choice of public transport, for example. Okay, so let's get into it now. Our other two panellists are here today, and they're going to have a lot to contribute, I'm sure. Many of you would know Samaras. Many of you would have heard him do the occasional spot on ABC Radio, where his straight-down-the-line analysis has earned him industry-wide respect. He has over 25 years of experience in politics, and as part of the Redbridge group, he specialises in combining research, analysis and marketing to provide the best campaign advice to political clients. He's also really interesting. If you follow him on Twitter, please make him very welcome. Pop up, Cos. And our other panellist is Jolic from Lendlease. She is the head of Victorian Communities. Her expertise in project management and leadership managing multidisciplinary teams has delivered landmark projects across Victoria and Western Australia. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to open it up for questions in the audience now. If anyone would like to kick us off, please raise your hand and start us off for the afternoon. I'll start you off while we're waiting. I'd like to ask you all how the outer suburbs have responded and dealt with the last 2 years. What changes have you seen, and what do you think needs to be done now?
You start on that one.
Perfect.
Okay, so what changes have occurred over the last 2 years? I would say that debt levels have gone up. I would say that people's employment situations have become more precarious. I would say that local use of roads and infrastructure have experienced significant increases in terms of strain, because there are obviously increased numbers of people that are working from home. And I would say as a result of the pandemic itself and the health impacts, that the local hospital system, local health system has suffered greatly. So individuals, well, we've had through our research that we've conducted now over the last 2 years, the most, I would say, most confronting conversations that we have with residents are in the outer suburbs when it comes to their experience. So it isn't just about the lockdown, it's about the health impact of the virus. It's now also the consequences of a health system that is obviously fatigued and overburdened. You know, we have stories now where people basically talk to us about, you know, they fear getting sick or having a sudden heart attack, for example, because it isn't just about the ambulance getting there on time. It's about, well, okay, does the ambulance get to me on time, or do I jump in the car and go to the hospital, and is the road going to be clogged? So that's all pervasive up there at the moment.
And Michael, you did mention that, didn't you, in your speech about it's all very well to go to a hospital, but what if you can't get there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that over the last 2 years, one of the, if anything, maybe a more positive outcome of our experience was, I think there's a new appreciation for community. Both understanding that we are part of a local community that we need to be a part of and support each other, but also realising that the local coffee shops are important parts of our community, the local sports clubs. And I think that new realisation should lead us to have a little bit of extra focus on developing those communities. And that's part of the thing that I think shines through most clearly in this research, is that if you believe that community is seriously important and that's getting more important, then the difference between the have and have not communities is more stark. And we need to make sure that we're raising them all to a decent standard. Some communities are great to live in, but they just don't have the same services.
Okay, I do have a question from the audience. Yeah. Yeah, great question.
And I'm just wondering if we had more GPs in the region, people could actually get access to them, even though the GPs are paranoid about COVID and respiratory stuff. That just takes the whole burden off our
Yeah, that's right.
people sitting in the hospital that don't need to be
Yeah.
there.
Can I add to that question? I wondered whether you had any sense of the impact. So Danielle Green, member for Yangon, and I found my own experience a few months ago, about 3 months ago. I sprained my ankle and I just needed an X-ray. I didn't want to go to the hospital. I rang every GP clinic in my electorate, and if I could get through, every single one of them was saying 2 to 3 weeks. And I've been, lobbying the previous federal government. I mean, and my daughter-in-law's a GP, so I know a fair bit about this, but the impact of cutting the workforce attraction for the outer suburbs, it was completely removed and only quite more remote regional areas can get it, whereas large areas in the northern, western and southeastern suburbs used to get it.
So you've still got 2 questions there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I think I actually tweeted about this like 3 weeks ago. One of the biggest issues that was coming up in our research in the outer suburbs was the concern from residents that they can no longer access GPs who are going to bulk bill. Particularly out in Melton. We were out there in Melton, and basically that was the biggest issue for them. And also, as you mentioned, Steve, the waiting times and so on. That has a compounding effect, obviously, as you've articulated, because that results in people going to their local hospital instead of actually getting treatment locally in their community. But it goes to a broader problem, which is not just something that we've picked up, but I think most people that study infrastructure would know, and we saw this in the pandemic. The outer suburbs have also got the lowest number of GPs per ratio per capita, right? And it also applies to chemists too, right? And that was quite evident when the vaccine rollout was occurring, where basically the outer suburban residents could not access the initial rollout of the vaccine, although they wanted to. And it wasn't until the Victorian government stumped up a solution, basically moving more hubs out there, where the uptake went through the roof. So, and that's because most people in the sort of LGA that I live in, which is in Hume, are shift workers, they're young. So the one thing that people were surprised when they saw those long queues lining up for vaccines, how young everyone was. Yes, because the median age is 32. They're all shift workers. They don't have time to drive 25k into the Moonee Ponds.
And they were often the people, as we talked about, Michael, that were working in the city and having to drive in for work throughout the pandemic.
Absolutely, and I think it's one of the interesting things that while the stats that we went through earlier were all about weekday travel and about overwhelmingly commuting, on weekends it always becomes more stark, the difference between access to services, because in general that's where it becomes more extreme. And so one of the things that means is that you do have, if you have a younger population that relies on these services for social or shift work, then outside of normal hours it's particularly difficult. And so I think it's a particular problem, and the importance of building communities, really.
And I think that's a good segue then to you, Anne. How much do government decisions about infrastructure spending impact development priorities and investment decisions for companies like yours?
It's a huge impact. So you've got to understand, I suppose, the way that a company like Lendlease operates. We're global. We're competing for capital with other projects around the world. You know, I compete for my urban, suburban communities projects. I compete with an urban regen project in New York for Lendlease capital, right? So I've got to demonstrate that the projects that we're investing in we're going to be able to create place, that they're well connected, that we're going to have thriving communities, that we're going to be able to leave a legacy, that we're going to have jobs created. Like for us, it's really about, it's not just about profit. It's about, are we going to leave this place better than we came in? Are we going to leave a legacy? And to do that, we need well-connected communities. We need to be able to invest ourselves in the infrastructure, but also know that it's already well-connected and has that, the prosperity that we know will come over the life of the project. So it's super important to us.
And then I'll ask you all now then, what does need to be done to ensure that those communities, as we create them, and our existing communities that are not right here within that 25k ring, what needs to be done to ensure that they are well connected then?
I think probably from our experience, the best, where we've done this well in the past is through partnerships, really. Like Melton's a good example. We've got a project with the City of Melton where we're partners, where council had the foresight to think, no, we're not just gonna, we're gonna invest heavily in this precinct. We're gonna do this over a long period of time. They had, ambitious plans for the major activity centre. We've got a rail line, we've got a hospital coming. Like that makes it very easy for us to come in and put our capital in to also fund the community infrastructure, get the maternal and child health, get the ovals, get the schools happening. Like where we can work in partnership, where we're bringing our funding with state and local governments, that's really where, the magic happens, I think.
And the floor is open. Oh, perfect.
I probably have two questions if I can be so bold.
Absolutely.
The first one is, my name's Peter Maynard, I'm the Mayor of the City of Wynnum. A little snapshot, 130 babies a week every week. Forget COVID, we're cracking at a pace. Just north of 300,000 people, 20 years we have just over 500,000 residents. When we, as a council, produce our annual reports and do our balance sheets, it shows that we're flush with cash. Thank you. I've got a pretty loud voice. It shows that we're flush with cash because the developer contributions that we get, and we're growing at a rate of knots as other interface councils are, we've got a lot of money. But we only spend it on certain, infrastructure. When we get assets gifted to us, the government of the day and the Auditor General looks at the assets that are classed as cash and think that we've got a lot of cash. So, we've been having an ongoing discussion about trying to change the way things are interpreted to show a true reflection on what the actual balance is, so it's not roads and curbs and things like that. And the other thing is, or the other question that I have, is that we get given developer contributions. I was wondering if you may be able to, and it's probably asking the, what are the tax lotto numbers for Saturday? What do you think would be a way of moving forward to have discussion with government to increase those developer contributions? Because realistically, they're 3/5 of not much, and by the time we get to spend them, they're worth 4/5 of less. Thank you.
We'll go along.
I'm happy to start with especially the first part of that question, and just say that. Well, I think we all feel like we've got less cash than really than we should have at the moment. But also, there's one of the biggest challenges when delivering this level of infrastructure in place is the different responsibilities between layers of government and key stakeholders. So you're talking about the developer, but you're also talking about local council. You're also talking about state government if you've got public transport. You're also talking about the federal government. So we end up with this scenario where often there's politics involved there too. And so one of the key things there is to be able to have some sort of coordination when it's a new place. And really one of the things that found in our research that the interface councils have in common with other communities is new communities are most pronounced in their disadvantage, in their inequality of infrastructure. So it's a problem for everyone, but it's also a particular problem for new communities, like you said, you're growing. And so when we have that scenario, we don't need to have big coordination for everything, but we do for some of these new communities. And that's why we've said, well, one group particularly that's worked well here in Victoria has been the Level Crossing Removal Authority. They've worked in a lot of different areas on disparate projects, and that's exactly the kind of expertise we need. And the only other thing I'd say is, I think when we're talking about developer contributions and things, it's got the same challenge where you have all these different people who all want a little bit more, and they're the easiest one to take it from. And I can't comment on the exact amount. I might leave it to my colleague. But one of the big challenges is, well, if you know that in advance and you know what your contribution you're making, that's fine. But how do you attract investment if it's always up in the air and uncertainty kills investment? So.
I'll second that. Uncertainty is the killer there. What I would say as a developer is that I think it's 50% of the state's revenue comes from the property industry and taxes. All of that flows through to affordability in the end. Right? And I think when you're a business, you need to hit a particular hurdle rate. Those change over time, but effectively, there's not much room. If we don't hit a hurdle, we can't invest capital, we can't proceed with a project. So I think, yes, and I acknowledge, I think developer contributions are generally underfunded, right? And I think there was that process of standardisation, and I think that helped the development industry to at least have a level playing field and know what they were getting into. I think that's really important to make sure projects can keep going, that developers have that certainty. But it all adds up, and we've seen an enormous amount of, developer levies, GAIC, there's been social and affordable housing levies, there's been, all sorts of additional taxes, changes to stamp duty that have meant the cost of land continues to go up. And that ultimately, because hurdle rates don't change, ultimately flows through to people. So I think it is a balancing act, and I think there's probably ways that we can garner more capital from other sources, and I think the report does a good job of suggesting this. The super funds have a lot of capital that they're looking to invest. How do we actually leverage our contributions and councils and super funds, for instance, to actually get 3 or 4 sources of funding for some of this infrastructure? I think there's ways that we can source more capital without just putting more tax burden on developers, and that flows through to purchasers.
Because I can see you nodding there.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful when it comes to finding solutions in terms of fixing some of these funding shortfalls, because I think up until now, it is our view that the current approach when it comes to planning and the way governments, all levels of government, interact with developers has only resulted in one thing: significant inflation of property prices. And the person that pays, or the people that pay, are the individuals that we're here talking on behalf of and trying to solve or trying to find solutions for. And we have to be careful in that space, because I think what is now going on is a cost of living crisis out there. And again, I'll go back to the research that we're performing on a regular basis. Every time we speak to people now, the most overwhelming concern that people have is their ability to actually keep their home. In the LGAs that you all represent. And based on some of the work that we've done in terms of modelling, where we think this is going to go, you're going to be dealing with hundreds of thousands of households that will be defaulting their mortgage. So we do not want to be adding to that problem.
Yeah, it's a frightening reality, isn't it? We're getting lots of questions from those who are joining us online, and also please raise your hand if you're in the room. This is from Mark Gallen. Can the panel comment on the lag between new suburbs popping up and the delay in the planning and delivery of future-proofed public transport networks? A good question.
Well, I've got a very particular point on this to make, and I take issue with another think tank that you might have heard of, the Grattan Institute, which is often their cities program has argued for more investigation and so on. One of the things we've got is, because everyone's so concerned about over-investing in a place, we under-invest instead. So because we're concerned that, well, that school might not be needed for another 10 years, so we don't build it now. And yet what we're finding, whether it's here or in other states, the second you build a school, it's full. And it's because we're more concerned about having an empty classroom than having a full classroom at the beginning, because that would then indicate that the government's been wasteful in some way. And so I think the solution there is really a change in mindset. We all have to become a little bit more tolerant of over-investment in the short term, which will then be utilised in the long term. It's that classic thing of you decide to build a new road and you build it 2 lanes when you really should be building it 3. The 3rd lane might be quite empty for the first 10 years, but it's going to be a lot more expensive to retrofit it later.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you both to respond to that one as well?
Yeah, I think almost every school we've ever had on a project is almost full or at capacity from day one. And I think developers have used a lot of smarts, I think, particularly with school delivery over the last sort of 10 years. There's all sorts of, developers are giving government land for schools in lieu of paying their gate contributions, which means, that's a transaction with the property team in the Department of Education, but it means, hopefully the school can come sooner. There's vendor financing arrangements where developers are effectively giving like a loan to private schools to ensure that they can actually build schools much earlier than they would have if they had to buy the land. So I think like the private sector is doing things to actually bring on amenity sooner. But again, like even with all those things, we actually can't keep up. And that's still the number one gripe, I think, for a lot of our new communities is, they want good quality, affordable education. They need it now. They need it from day one. And they're making their decisions about where to live based on that and on access to really transport infrastructure, both road and rail.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Cos?
I think the problem that we've had up until now is that policy solutions in this space have always been reactive. So, decision makers wait for the problem to be sitting there, people to be queuing up on a single lane, small arterial, two schools to be overflowing before a new one is built. I think the way you alleviate the stress that outer suburban people are experiencing right now is you've got to do pretty much what all my colleagues have just actually talked about.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Brett Luxford from Mitchell Shire, so you had to drive in. There was no public transport from Mitchell in. So, a number of questions have been going through my mind as you've been talking. I think I started thinking about health and the mental health issues, particularly out in the interface areas. And, just our example, we face family violence rates which are twice the national average or twice the state average. And as you go through mortgage defaults, as you go through interest rates going higher, you even get further stress. So the access to services, the mental health services are not there. What I did land on in my question over mind was, because we are talking about infrastructure, was particularly around, we're seeing densities now at 21 houses per hectare, yet the public open space allowance has not increased over the time. So I'm interested in the thoughts of the panel, particularly from our Lendlease partner up there, about the role of our partners, our development partners, in providing those quality public open spaces, and also the government in providing regional public open space as well.
Yeah, I think some of our best projects are ones, Harpley and Wyndham's a good example. We've got a lake and extensive open space across that project. And I think that does allow us to do higher density, to actually have a better value proposition. People feel the green space, the sense of, greenery in that project. It's a better environment to live in. People feel happier because they use the walking trails and the bike trails. And, I think developers would actually love to do more open space. I think we're very restrictive in terms of, the size of open space, and it always tends to go to how are we going to maintain that? What's the cost of maintenance? No, we don't want to put, too much in. We don't, it has to be, there needs to be a quality of open space across the municipality, and, so there's all those considerations I think we deal with, but ultimately the more we can actually put in from Lendlease's point of view, the better a project we have, the more sales we're going to make, the more density we can do. It all adds to a better project.
Michael, you mentioned about open space in your earlier remarks, didn't you?
Yeah, and I was very surprised by that finding. I thought it was going to be the one bit of research where we found that you were overrepresented, to be honest, because of the size and the density issues. The truth is, it's the distinguishing feature between a sort of strip on the side of the road versus a park. The usable open space is actually difficult to maintain, and it does require forward planning, just like any other infrastructure. And we're only beginning really to treat it in the same way. So I can't speak more favourably other than for that, because it goes to also your mental health question and everything else. We've got to realise that there's so many different aspects to this, and there won't be one way of sorting it out. But what there is a way of saying that the people who are invested in each of these areas, so whether it's the decision makers through the developers or through the councils or the people themselves who are crying out to have their voices heard, all of them need to be in the same room saying, so that when they say what they want and they get it when they need it.
So, Cos, how do we get that to actually happen?
I think, as Michael mentioned, basically when it comes to planning, making sure that effort is made to ensure that people's living spaces are welcoming, that they have somewhere to actually recreate. These policy outcomes are absolutely vitally important, because our health system is actually monetised. So it's no accident that if you're going to access a mental health specialist, it is very hard if you're in the outer suburbs, because you just don't make money as a mental health specialist in the outer suburbs as you would if you're living in Hawthorn, for example. Sorry, if you're practising in Hawthorn. So it applies to GPs that I mentioned before, where you've got 60 GPs within a 5 kilometre radius of Hawthorn, yet you've got 3 servicing Craigieburn, centres. And I can go on and on and on. So I think what can those individuals who are in the game of governing for these communities can do, that what is in your control, it's these sort of solutions, which is, okay, what can you do to actually help them, avoid developing mental health issues, for example, during a time of extreme stress.
That GP example really highlights the differential, doesn't it? We've got a question in the middle of the room there too.
Yeah, thank you. Craig Lloyd, City of Whittlesea. Michael mentioned earlier on the Infrastructure Victoria report. It's a very good report, makes a very clear set of recommendations, but I note that the state government's only accepted some of those recommendations in principle. Are you able to talk a little bit about what any further delays to the implementation of that plan would be to the interface areas?
I mean, the Infrastructure Victoria report was quite extensive, and so in some way it did exactly what we need it to do, which is to look at everything. So in that way, I think I always urge governments should in general be trying to take on every recommendation. I don't know what those specific recommendations are, so I don't want to comment too specifically on them. Except I would say this, so we're only in, if I were to compare it to other state infrastructure strategies, so in New South Wales, they look at it as the 30-minute city. That's how they kind of conceptualise it. In Queensland, they've had a long time target about the number of people living within 400 metres of a train station and 200 metres of a bus stop. That was a target that actually was first pioneered here in Victoria before you've sort of moved on a little bit to that. The key to all those is that they're still heavily based on the transport modes. And I know I spoke a lot about that too, and it's a bias because transport's still the biggest spend in the infrastructure space. And so I used to make the comment that it's cheaper to build a stadium at a train line than a train line to a stadium. But that's not to say that it's the only thing that's important. And that's why we emphasise community infrastructure and community space. And so I'm sorry I don't know those recommendations. I'd love actually to hear it from you afterwards. But I would say that in general we've got to be looking at everything across the board, not just one.
Okay, we've got a question from the National Growth Alliance who are joining us online. What would convince state and federal governments that we have the chance to build the world's best new suburbs for the long term rather than a rapid response to meet current market demand? I might start with you, Anne, for that one.
Yeah, I think it's just, like I see sort of someone like Lendlease, like we have the opportunity to be like an enabler, right? We've got projects, we've got things we want to achieve. We can bring, state, local, we can bring a commercial aspect to it. We can bring, all the projects that we do generally have JV partners, capital investment. I think, that is what I see our role as, actually bringing it together and trying things. Like, I think we're a bit risk averse, just generally. And, why can't we just try some things? Maybe, I can get some faster planning approvals, and off the back of that, that's going to save me X amount of money, and I'm going to invest that or gift some land to set up a GP practice. We just need to try more, see what works.
Cos, what do you think about that?
I've actually been assisting one company that is attempting to build exactly the sort of suburb that I think everyone's got in mind. It's out in the back of Bacchus Marsh. It's called the Miramoo Estate, and they are basically being dragged through the mud to try to get this project up and running. Planning processes are very lethargic in this state. Now, this concept is building a community, very, very significant bit of development, but also bringing the employers there. So they've got agreement with ANZ and other employers to attract white-collar workers to move to these new abodes and live and work locally. That's a sort of, I think, development that does work, where corporate world partners with developers and government to start building more sustainable communities.
Can I just jump in there? Because I agree 100% with that, but I also want to do a little bit of a defence of the public service on some research we did on a part of a separate project. I mean, the public service has increasingly been not empowered to make these kind of decisions. And it's really, like the issues, whether it's in planning or in anything else, are largely because they're completely punished for taking risk and not rewarded in any way for successful risk. In the way that the private sector is. And that is to say that you need, the only place where that can come from is courage from political leaders. And that's also including in councils. It's going to take some courage from leaders in councils to say, you know, we've always got a balance between growth and the existing community that's there, but I'm going to take a risk and say, in 10 years, I want this community to exist and look like this. And I think that's really hard for you to do, but it should be done. Okay, Danielle?
Thank you. I just wanted to say, on the back of what the the Growth Alliance has said, but also on your point around schools, Craig Lloyd and I were standing next to each other and we were sort of going, that's not our experience with schools. And I'm sorry, Anne, I haven't met you from Lendlease before, but I'd say one of the Lendlease developments in my electorate, Lorimer, which wasn't originally started by Lendlease, but Lendlease took it over and turbocharged it. And the success of that was the partnerships. And I think the city, and Cos has said about planning processes were quicker. I've been in Parliament 20 years. David Turnbull, the late great, just an amazing planner who was the planner and then CEO at the Craig's predecessor at Whittlesea. Whittlesea didn't actually get much money out of the growth areas infrastructure charge because it was only paid once PSPs were completed. And the reason was that Whittlesea had almost all their PSPs completed well ahead of time. And I think that that's really key, and the partnerships that you have. And so I think David led the partnerships and he'd say, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to have a developers conference, we're going to sit there for 3 days until we agree. No one's allowed out the door. And it was just, they locked down every step of what was going to happen. The partnership also with state government, you know, we partnered with Lendlease and what was then the Department of Victorian Communities and the local school, the Lorimer Primary School, which wasn't full as soon as it opened, and grew the sporting clubs. The Lorimer Football Club has been going 12 years, I think, has the second highest membership in the Northern Football League. And when they first put a men's seniors team on the ground, that was when they put a women's senior team on the ground. And so that collaboration has really delivered benefits. It is a strong community. You know, it's not without its problems, but I get worried as a representative of this area because I don't want people to not want to invest in these areas and not want to live there. And those people there do have, and urban design has a whole lot to do with it. Local jobs. I want to commend the City of Whittlesea because of the work they did about looking at women's work and whether they were able to get what their qualifications were and if they were able to get jobs near home. Yes, it's been tough with COVID, but I think there are opportunities coming out of this because I look at the difference. My sisters live in a city. In the outer suburbs, there are not near as many empty shops as there are in the inner city. So I think there are opportunities for that vibrancy and going forward. The final thing I want to say on libraries, that we've had a pretty good delivery of libraries in Whittlesea as well. And I think the key to that might be the Yarra Plenty Library Service because it goes across 3 local government areas, the second largest number of boroughs in the country. And I think having that scale, as well as having a government program to apply, but I think that's probably the reason why we've had that higher and earlier opening of libraries.
So there were a number of questions there. Would you?
I was just going to say on that, you know, David had the foresight to, you know, the Aurora project really was that foresight to not allow land fragmentation in what council saw as a real opportunity to just accelerate growth and delivery of services. And I think that's sort of, I think what we're talking about is that vision. You need to have that vision and that foresight and then stay true to that plan. You know, it took a long time to actually realise that, but, you know, that level of amenity, the interchanges, the town centre, the schools, the community facilities, you know, in that whole region, that's right. Yeah. And really at a time when that could have been easily fragmented and sold off, and council, you know, remained true to that vision.
Okay, Michael.
I think, well, I love hearing good stories as well, and I have been very negative about today, so I do want to acknowledge that. But also to say that it is really important not to stigmatise communities just because there is a difference in some access. And in particular, the reason why a lot of these communities are full is precisely because people are moving there, right? So people are saying with their feet, there's something about this community I love, right? But then there's something that's missing in many cases. And that might be trains, it might be libraries, it's a different thing often in different areas. I think one of the things about the schools in particular, to answer that part of your question, is that we looked at that purely in a greenfield site area, so I'm not sure, I'd love to hear about it again more afterwards, but you know, often, and maybe that's something that is less common than I thought, but you know, certainly there's I think a lot of scope to grow because people are moving to these areas.
Okay. I think, Cos, I'll get you to respond to that one as well.
I'll just make a comment around why people move to these suburbs. Yeah. If you think about most of the LGAs that I think everyone here represents, it is largely now driven by, I would say, first-generation migrants who are moving to particular suburbs around Melbourne that are attracted to that sort of community environment. So, you know, Australians originally from India and other communities are very similar. They move out to these suburbs because there are people from their country that are also moving out there. It is an experience that I think every migrant wave that has come through this country has done. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, it was Footscray, Northcote, Oakley, right, being a Greek, and then other, you know, Italians were the same, and every generation that comes through, it finds a home, and the home for the migrants of the last 20 years is effectively interface councils. And that's why I think it's also important for this conversation to occur, and why it's important for this report to be actually widely circulated and reported on, is because we're talking about the fastest growing new constituencies in the state of Victoria and possibly the country. And they're going to be a very significant electoral cohort, and those in government, I don't care what colour they are, will have to actually pay attention to them, otherwise they'll lose their seats.
Great point. We've got a question from the floor over here.
Yeah, Jim Child, Mayor of Yarra Ranges Council. We're probably different to any of the other interface councils. We have the largest green wedge, and that green wedge is the lungs of Melbourne. The Yarra Valley, all those wineries and all those great destinations. So we've got a significant project at the moment which will give jobs. We've got funding to $11.3 million, supported by the state government, the Growing Suburbs Fund, the Regional Growth Fund of the federal government, the council, and also community, to a total tune for stage one of $11.3 million, and the community contribution was $300,000. Our problem is, and I've got to be careful where we meet, is this place. We've had to go through a full AEST process for this project. It's cost us in excess of $5 million, and that's before we've even turned one shovel of soil. So how do we overcome that problem?
So what you're essentially asking there is, how do we cut red tape to actually get things to happen, right? So, Cos, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, you've been talking about this type of thing for a long time.
I think I'll just touch on what Michael said before, and that is I think decision makers in this state, governments, creating an environment where the public service is willing to take risks and willing to make decisions rapidly. Otherwise, I think at the moment, my experience with public service when dealing with community groups that are trying to develop projects is one of extreme caution, fear of making decisions, and it is choking the state in terms of processes, and it just compounds cost.
Mm. So, Michael, what can councils do then to get things moving?
Well, I think this comes back to that some sort of body that is bringing together them on the same page. I think there's so many, there's lots of different, red tape programs, but I've never seen one that really works, to be perfectly honest. I think you need to have a group that's going to bring everyone into the same room, headed by someone who is influential enough to show leadership on it, and that means, whether it's the Level Crossing Removal Authority, as we suggested, or whether it's some other body, but that's what we would suggest. The only thing I would say is that can't be a replication of other bureaucracy. It needs to be something that's bringing together what's already there, and I'd say that there's other people who have a lot more experience navigating this than I do, so I might overthrow to them.
I'll just say, I think actually the VPA's done a very good job of prioritising precincts and, making it clear where growth will happen and prioritising particular projects. So, the emphasis is on that. I think where it falls down is post-PSP processes and, a lot of cases I sort of worry for you because I think it could get worse, actually later down the track, because I think that's where, you're grappling with Vic Roads and the Water Authority, and it's almost like you're starting again. We go through rezoning processes with the BPA and we think all the authorities are on board and we're all heading in the right direction. Everyone says, yep, this precinct's ready for development. And then we effectively start again. We go into Vic Roads and they say, oh no, that doesn't work, we don't like that. Or we weren't thinking about it properly back then because it was too far out. Now that it's real, we'll look at it. And then you're in this years process of detail, and we're having to fund water infrastructure and things because it's, they deem it as out of sequence, even though you've been talking about it for 5 years. Yeah. So it's a bit of a minefield. But to your point, Michael, I think it's just about, we all have the vision, we have to have the vision and then a permission to execute, really, and not get bogged down with the way we always do things.
You try telling that to the constituents, though.
It is very difficult. Great answers. We've got time for one more question.
All right, thanks very much. Bill Chisholm, Mitchell Shire. Just a quick question. Has any thought been given to the new uplift tax coming back to where it's been taken from? I think that'd be an excellent funding stream for some of the newer growth areas.
I would love that, personally. I think the development industry, this is why we loved Gay Quick and we like to do works in kind projects, right? Because if I'm paying taxes or levies, if I can actually build those into the communities that are actually generating that levy, that's an ideal situation for me. I think the state's been reluctant to do that. I'll say very quietly.
You want to say something now?
Oh, look, that goes to a broader problem, doesn't it? I mean, I think I made a comment online this morning about the free tram service, for example. That is paid by all of the Victorian taxpayers, but only a service accessible to a certain type of person in this state. And I think that is a systemic problem right across a whole range of different levels of government.
We'll finish with you, Michael.
I agree. But I'd almost even say it should go in reverse. I mean, I think places with good, I go back to public transport, but it's the one that's easiest to illustrate. But if you've got good public transport, that's partly because previous generations invested to build it. And you have a responsibility then to extend that same opportunity to places that don't have it now. And so I actually think it should be, the money should go back to where it is, but also money that other people are generating should be going back to extend the same equal opportunity that they got the advantage of to others. And it's just, I think, part of civic responsibility.
Frame that.
I was going to say, that is a really good place to wrap up our discussion, which I think was fascinating for everyone here, not just in the room, for online. I'd really like to thank our panel for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much for your insights and time. We're right on time. Thank you again for joining us for what was a really insightful discussion, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks very much.